Hi, everybody. We have gathered on the other side of the channel to talk about the side channel. My name is Andrei, and together with my partner in crime, Dan,
Hi.
We're going to talk about bypassing KPTI using the speculative behavior of the SWAPGS instruction. As a short bio about us, my daily job is doing hypervisor-based memory introspection, and Dan is working on developing anti-exploit technologies. Both work for Bitdefender. I've been with Bitdefender for 11 years. He's been like 14 years, so yeah. And when we join our powers, we do all kind of freaky stuff, such as side channels and other security research. OK, so we're going to go through the introduction. We're going to talk about how side channels work, short recap. Dan is going to talk about speculative segmentation. I'm going to dig into exploiting the SWAPGS instruction. And then we're going to go through mitigations and recommendations in order to avoid this issue. So what is the problem? Well, the problem, in a nutshell, is that the SWAPGS instruction can be executed speculatively. And this leads to two potential issues. The first one, inside user space, because SWAPGS can be executed speculatively inside user space as well, leads to a variant of ROG system register load, which, as the traditional ROG system register load, allows for KSLR bypass and leaking memory from areas which should be hidden by address space layout randomization. Inside kernel space, however, there are two variants. Type 1, when SWAPGS is not getting executed speculatively, even if it should. And type 2, where SWAPGS gets speculatively executed, even if it shouldn't. And we have investigated the type 2 scenario inside kernel space, because as we will immediately see, this allows for rather easy memory leaking from inside the user space. All right. So SWAPGS attack is basically a new variant of Spectre, right? And you can leak portions of the kernel memory even if the system is patched against Spectre, Meltdown, L1TF, MDS, and so on. Luckily, a patch has been issued by Microsoft. It was issued roughly a month before the problem was published. And Intel didn't address, and I don't think they are planning to address this issue in Silicon in the foreseeable future. The affected CPUs, pretty much all the 64-bit CPUs, starting with Ivy Bridge. They must support the SWAPGS instruction, of course, and for simple exploitation, they also have to support the write.js base instruction. AMD CPUs are also vulnerable, but only to the SWAPGS scenario or type 1. And as for the affected OSs, we've tested our exploit on Windows 7 and newer, so 7, 8, 8.1, Windows 10, and so on. And from our analysis, it looks like the Linux OSs are pretty much impossible to exploit, right? And this being said, I'm going to invite Dan to get the side channel going.
Hello. So we'll describe next the prerequisites and the building blocks needed for the attack, detailing the workings of Spectre and Meltdown as they are related directly to our attacks. So a case side channel attack allows an attacker to infer information about a victim by making careful measurements. The main cause is that both the attacker and the victim code execute on the same hardware thread, and victim execution makes cache modifications that are observable by the attacker. So how this works? First, the attacker brings the cache to a known state, then executes victim code, which will modify cache content, and then the attacker determines what was modified by performing cache access time measurements. For example, let's see if, as an attacker, we want to check if a variable has been previously accessed or not. First, the attacker flushes the test variable from the cache, executes the victim code, then measures how long it takes to access that test variable again. Now, if the access time is small, it means that the variable has been accessed by the victim execution. If the access time is high, then the variable has not been accessed. Such attacks are already demonstrated in the literature. We have prefetch attacks, TSX attacks, and so on. There are many measurement techniques, such as flush and reload, evict and time, prime and probe, each suitable for different attack scenarios. Each technique allows the attacker to probe for memory accesses made by the victim. In our attacks, we use flush and reload. For example, flushing the test variable, executing the victim, then re-accessing the test variable. And if the access time is low, then victim execution accessed part of the cache, including our test variable, or else it did not. In early 2018, a new class of side channels, speculative side channels, emerged, such as Spectra, Meltdown, L1TF, and so on. They allow information disclosure across arbitrary security boundaries and cannot be detected by modern software. Mitigations for these attacks involve microcode updates in the CPU or software mitigations made by the operating system kernels or compilers. We'll touch a bit on Spectra and Meltdown as they are directly related to our attack. The main problem with Spectra, for performance reasons, modern CPUs use branch prediction to predict the outcome of a comparison in a conditional branch, in an if statement, before the actual outcome is computed. For example, if one of the operands is in memory, without using prediction, the CPU will have to wait for the memory access to happen, which is slow, and thus wasting precious computing cycles. Whenever an if is encountered, the CPU will try to guess the correct branch direction, either taken or not taken. If the guess is correct, then the execution proceeds normally. If the guess is not correct, then the CPU has to discard all executed instructions and begin executing the correct branch. We have a simple example here, a simple if condition, and let's assume that for a given set of inputs, the branch predictor mispredicts the result, so foo is executed speculatively. Now, speculative execution does not affect the architectural visible CPU state, such as the registers. However, instructions that access memory during speculative execution leave traces in the CPU caches, and those traces can be recovered by using the previously discussed cache size channels, such as a flush and reload. The CPU detects the mispredicted branch, discards the result of the speculative execution of foo, and executes the false branch, which is the correct path. Now, for another set of inputs, the CPU still predicts that the branch will be taken, so foo will execute speculatively. And since the branch was predicted correctly, the results are committed to the architectural state and become visible to the programmer. A bit about Meltdown. Modern operating systems use hardware mechanisms for preventing user mode code access to kernel mode code and data. Now, when accessing memory, the CPU translates a virtual address into a physical address by consulting the page tables, which are under the operating system control. They cannot be modified by user mode code. The operating system configures page tables to isolate user mode code from accessing kernel mode data. For example, a virtual address cannot be used in user mode to access physical memory if the page table entries translating that virtual address don't have a special bit, a special flag, user supervisor flag set. Now, classical Meltdown abuses the fact that ring 3 out-of-order execution of memory load instructions can temporarily access kernel mode data if a virtual address translation exists in the process page tables for that kernel mode address, even if that user supervisor bit in the PTE is not set. Mitigations for Meltdown are either in hardware, in newer CPUs, or in software at the operating system level. Now, software mitigations, such as KPTI or KVA shadow, unmap the kernel address space while the CPU executes in ring 3. They use a split page table architecture. They use 2 sets of page tables. One set is used when executing in ring 3, and that set doesn't contain any kernel mode virtual address translations. And the other set is used when executing in ring 0, which contains kernel mode virtual address translations and user mode virtual address translations. If no virtual address translations are present for a kernel mode address in the set used in user mode, then no leak can occur during out-of-order loads. So we consider meltdown solved. While the CPU executes in ring 0, on Windows operating systems, the kernel mode page table also maps the user mode address space. So we saw that meltdown abuses parts of the virtual address translation mechanism, mainly the page tables. But the act of translating a virtual address to a physical address involves more than just the page tables. It involves an earlier memory protection mechanism used before page tables were invented, called segmentation. We researched what happens when segmentation instructions are executed speculatively. Now, segmentation is used to compose a linear address from a logical address, which is composed of a segment selector and an offset into that segment. The segment selector is used as an index into the GDT, the global descriptor table, to select a segment descriptor which contains information about the segment, such as the base address and its access rights. Next, that base address is added to the offset and is used to form the linear address, which will be further translated via the page tables. Now, details of the segmentation process are largely invisible to the programmer because x86 instructions use implicit segments when executed or during memory accesses. For example, when executing code, the implicit code segment is CS. When accessing data, the implicit data segment is either DS or stack, SS. However, the x86 architecture allows a segment override for most instructions, forcing the forming of a linear address from a user-specified segment. To speed up the computation of the linear address, special segment registers inside the CPU cache the segment base and access rights into a hidden portion whenever a new segment descriptor is loaded. Two segments, FS and GS, have their segment registers bases physically mapped to model-specific registers. The FS segment register is mapped to IR32 FS base MSR, and the GS segment register base is mapped to IR32 GS base MSR. Now, the GS segment has a dedicated functionality on Windows on x64 platforms. When executing in user mode, it is used to store information about the currently executing thread. When the CPU executes in ring 0, the GS segment is used to access per logical CPU information stored in the kernel processor control region. This is a special structure maintained by the operating system and also contains pointers inside the NT-OS kernel. On user-to-kernel transitions, the kernel uses the SWAPGS instruction to exchange the contents of the IR32 GS base MSR with the IR32 kernel GS base MSR. So further memory accesses via the GS segment overrides will point into the kernel processor control region. And on kernel to user transitions, before returning control to user mode, the kernel again uses SWAPGS. So further memory accesses via the GS segment overrides will point into the thread environment block in user mode. We studied the security implications of speculatively executing segmentation-related instructions on Intel CPUs, on x86 CPUs. So we have two key technical findings. The first one is that during speculative execution, after loading the GS or FS segment registers with an invalid segment selector, and then subsequently using that segment in further speculatively executed memory access instructions, Intel CPUs use the previously stored segment base address of the segment register to compute the linear address used for memory addressing. And the second technical finding is that a value written speculatively to the base of a segment register survives instruction retirement and can be later retrieved by loading an invalid segment selector into that segment register. Now, these two technical findings give birth to 5 security implications. All these security implications were responsibly disclosed to Intel, of course. The first one, subverting KSLR, has the biggest impact as it allows to de-randomize the base address of the kernel and find its layout, but not its content. Bypassing KSLR is often a prerequisite step in performing a local privilege escalation, and this attack, because it's using hardware vulnerabilities, it's largely invisible to current detection mechanisms. The rest of the security implications have minor impact on modern up-to-date operating systems. Both us and Intel agreed that existing mitigations present in Windows and Linux, such as SMAP, SMAP, and RSB stuffing, are enough to protect against exploiting them. Now, we won't go into detail into each of these security implications. Detailed descriptions for all of those can be found in the white paper, which is available online. We'll show, however, a walkthrough of subverting Windows KSLR using this finding. So first, we'll try to retrieve the IR32 kernel GS-base MSR value from user mode. Normally, you can't read this MSR using read MSR instruction because that would generate a general protection fault since it's not accessible in ring 3. If we get to this value of the IR32 kernel GS-base, then we'll on Windows, this will give us the pointer to the KPCR, to the kernel processor control region. So let's assume we execute code in ring 3 in an unprivileged process on Windows x64. We have the current GS base equals IR32 GS base. The MSR value is the pointer to the thread environment block. And the previous GS base equals IR32 kernel GS base. The MSR value pointing to the kernel processor control region as a result from prior execution in kernel mode. If we run the following code in user mode on Windows, it will allow us to retrieve the value of the IR32 kernel GS-base MSR. So first, we force a page fault and force the CPU to speculatively execute all the next instructions. Next, we load an invalid segment selector into register, into R9. That selector is way outside the GTT limit. We then load the invalid segment selector into the GS segment register. This would cause a fault, since the descriptor points outside of the GTT limit. And next, we use read GS-base, a valid instruction in ring 3, to read the GS-base value. Now, normally, we would expect the destination register, RUX, to contain the value of the IR32 GS-base MSR, since we are executing in user mode. But it contains instead the value of IR32 kernel GS-base MSR, as a weird side effect of previously loading an invalid segment selector into the GS segment register. Next, lines 5 to 8 represent the classical flush and reload side channel. We won't go into details. Using the same approach, the same pattern, we can leak direct values from KPCR, thus leaking pointers from inside NTOS kernel. This time, we load a valid segment selector into the GS segment register. However, its desired privilege level is 0, meaning that access through memory through this selector is only possible if the CPU executes in ring 0. Note that we execute this code in ring 3, so we expect that further accesses from ring 3 through GS will raise a general protection exception. Instead, when accessing memory through the invalid in ring 3 selector, because these instructions execute speculatively and access checking is delayed until instruction retirement, and because a valid translation exists in the process page tables for the KPCR on Windows, the value of the byte in the KPCR is moved into RUX, and then further used in the classical flush and reload, lines 5 and 10. So, in conclusion, reading arbitrary values from KPCR allows us to retrieve pointers inside NTOS kernel, thus subverting Windows KSLR. Now, all these segmentation instructions executing speculatively gave us some insights, two key insights. The first one is, since during speculative execution and segmentation instructions in ring 3, we can access MSRs in kernel mode and kernel data, it follows that during speculative execution of segmentation instructions in kernel mode, we can force the kernel to access IR32GS base and user mode data. And the second insight is if we can force speculative execution of segmentation instructions in ring 0 after the kernel moved to its kernel page tables, we may be able to force it to access arbitrary data in memory, now that kernel memory is mapped. So we reach a research question, is can we find instances of such instructions in modern operating system kernels, and can we identify speculatively executed gadgets around them that would leak arbitrary kernel memory, thus defeating KPTI? And an answer to this question will be given by Andrei.
Yes, there's really only one option for this question, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So yes, we can. And combining what we've already seen about SWAPGS being executable speculatively, and with what Dan pointed out that the CPU curiously handles segment-related instructions, we thought about, okay, what if SWAPGS gets executed speculatively inside the kernel? Could we find an interesting gadget? Could you leak memory after the kernel page tables are loaded, and so on? So a quick introduction about the SWAPGS instruction for those of you who are unfamiliar with system programming. SWAPGS is a system instruction which was introduced in the 64-bit x86 architecture. Segmentation is mostly disabled in 64 bits. So each segment is considered with a base of 0 and basically infinite limit. But FS and GS segments are still usable. However, they are treated somewhat differently in that instead of using the GDT to get their base addresses, two MSRs are used, just like Dan pointed out, the IA32 FS base and GS base. The SWAPGS instruction uses also a third such MSR, which is the IA32 kernel GS base. And what it does, it swaps the value of GS base with the kernel GS base. And we also have the write FS base and write GS base instructions, which can be executed inside ring 3, which is important for our exploitation technique. So the first scenario of the SWAPGS attack. In this scenario, you have code inside the kernel which would require SWAPGS to be executed, but instead, due to a misspeculated branch, the SWAPGS never gets to be executed. And this type of code is located at the entry point of each exception handler of the Windows kernel. Right here we have a clear example. This is a piece of assembly code taken directly from the page forward shadow handler inside Windows kernel. And whenever a page forward is triggered either in user space or kernel space, these are the first instructions that get to be executed. The first instruction is a test instruction followed by a conditional branch, which, if the test instruction is true, would be taken and the label, the instructions lying at the following label would be executed. However, if the branch is mispredicted and is not taken, the SWAPGS instruction would not be executed, and due to this, the old GS, the GS that was loaded before the exception took place, would still be used. Normally, the execution should continue at the following label after the SWAPGS has been executed and the GS has been loaded. This scenario is rather hardly exploitable. We didn't give it too much attention because there is a lower hanging fruit in the scenario 2, which is when the SWAPGS instruction gets to be executed speculatively even if it shouldn't. And this is rather easily exploitable because there are several gadgets which make it very easy to mount an attack. This is another piece of assembly code taken from the same page forward handler. And this code, again, is present inside all the exception and interrupt handlers inside the Windows kernel. This is an actual copy-paste. So the first instruction, again, a test instruction, test a variable, test the first bit inside the KVI shadow variable, and it executes a conditional branch. Now, normally, what happens is that the branch should be taken, and the execution should continue with the instruction following the SWAPGS instruction. So SWAPGS should not be executed. However, if the branch is mispredicted, SWAPGS is executed speculatively, and execution continues with the following instructions, which begin to reference GS-based memory. And GS-based memory in this scenario would basically be attacker-controlled memory, because once you execute SWAPGS, you make the user-controlled GS active. Okay, so how many such gadgets are there? Well, before the issue was patched on an RS5 x64 kernel, we counted exactly 38 such gadgets. And most of them lie inside the exception handlers, which are easily executable by simply generating faults inside user space. Like simply triggering a page fault or executing an invalid instruction would eventually lead to the execution of such gadget. Okay, but how can we leak values? Because as Dan pointed out, you would need, usually in order to leak values, you would use the byte value that you wish to leak as an offset inside attacker-controlled memory, okay? This is the regular scenario, right? You access a byte, you use it as an offset inside attacker-controlled memory, and then you probe the attacker-controlled memory to see which part of it has been cached. And depending on which part has been cached, you can infer the value of that byte. But our chunk of code doesn't even remotely look like something that we could use to directly leak values. But what we have instead with these gadgets are a few instructions using GS-based addressing, okay? And let's take a closer look at this gadget. This gadget makes several GS references, okay? The first access, the one that loads RCX from offset 188 inside GS, is then used for another dereference, which loads into RCX another value from the address pointed by RCX plus 220. And then we have yet another access, which yet again loads into RCX, the value located at RCX plus 830. So we have several memory accesses in somewhat of a chained manner. And we thought about it, and we thought, okay, so let's say that inside GS segment at offset 188, we have value 1000. And let us assume that we map address 1000 inside user space, right? We trigger the gadget to be executed speculatively, and once it executes speculatively, address 1000 plus 220 gets cached, right? Because the value that is located inside GS plus 188 resembles a valid user mode address. So what we actually do, instead of using the kernel value to be leaked as an offset inside attacker-controlled memory, we use the kernel value to be leaked as a user mode address. And we leverage a direct access into it in order to infer its value. All right, so digging into the second scenario where we exploit the fact that the SWAPGS instruction gets executed speculatively even if it shouldn't, we've identified two use cases for this exploit. The first one, simply search for kernel values, right? This is some sort of a brute force attack where you simply iterate the kernel space to see at what addresses you can find a value of your choice. And the way this would work is we have the attacker process on the left-hand side of the screen, and we have the kernel space. The GS base normally points while inside user space to the thread information block, and the inactive kernel GS base points to the KPCR. Let's assume that inside the kernel, at a certain address, there is a value that we are searching for inside the kernel memory, okay? For those of you who are somewhat familiar with reverse engineering and the PE file format, you would immediately see that this is actually the MZ signature, and this particular keyword value is the actual value which is located in the first 8 bytes of the Windows NT kernel image. All right, so we map inside user space memory, we map an address which resembles the value to be leaked. And we fill it with whatever values. We don't really care what right now. What we want to see if a particular offset inside this attacker-controlled memory inside user space gets cached. In our particular use case, we are interested about offset A4D plus 220 because this is the exact offset of the keyword value inside the anti-header plus the offset used by the JS-based, by the instruction following the JS-based addressing. We issue a user to kernel transition. One of the first, we use write JS-base first to make the JS-base point to the kernel memory, minus 188, and we issue a user to kernel transition. Now, one of the first things that happens after a user to kernel transition is SWAPGS is being executed, and the JS base and the kernel JS base are being swapped. Right now, the JS base points the KPCR, as it should, the regular kernel processor control region, and the inactive kernel JS base points to our attacker-controlled memory, which we wish to leak. Many instructions get to be executed inside the kernel, and eventually we hit the vulnerable gadget. And in the best case scenario, of course, the gadget gets mispredicted, and SWAPGS instruction is executed speculatively. Now the JS base points again to the attacker-controlled memory, and the inactive kernel JS base points back to the KPCR. And we have the first JS base access, which loads the secret value inside R10. We have another access at the same address, which loads the secret value inside RCX. And then we have an access which further dereferences RCX and loads a keyword from there. And you would immediately see that since we have mapped the address that equals the secret value, we immediately can see that this offset gets cached, right? So after the misprediction is detected, everything is rolled back, even the GS and kernel JS bases are swapped again to roll back to the original architectural state. We get back to user space, and one thing has changed. The offset that we are after got cached. And this way, we can infer that the value at that address inside the kernel space is inside that range with a cache line bias. So basically aligned to 64 bytes and up to plus 64 bytes, somewhere in between. OK, this is pretty neat. So we can probe a kernel address to see if the value located there is of a particular value, right? But this was not quite enough for us. We wanted to be able to leak more values. We wanted to be able to leak arbitrary values from arbitrary addresses, not simply probing or searching for values inside kernel memory. So we thought about it, and we got to this extension of the first variant, which allows the attacker to potentially leak any other value from inside the kernel space as long as they resemble valid user mode addresses. And the attack is very similar to the first variant. We have the user space, the attacker process, and we have kernel space. The JS base points to the thread information block. We have the inactive kernel JS base pointing to KPCR. We have a secret value inside the kernel space, and this time we have no idea what that value is. Unlike the first scenario where we wanted to see if that value is located at that address, this time we don't know anything about this value. So what we do, first of all, we allocate a test variable, right? And then we start ideally from address 0, and we allocate chunks of memory, which we have deduced by doing experiments that the optimum size is the less level caching size. So if the less level caching size is 8 megabytes, you would start by allocating an 8 megabyte chunk at address 0 and run the attack. And then move on with 8 megabytes chunk, address by address, until you see which chunk contains the range, the potential range of the value located inside the kernel. And for simplicity, of course, we've skipped in the presentation directly to the target address. And yeah, we can assume that we've already brute forced 15 terabytes of memory. This is not very relevant right now. But let's assume we directly map exactly the value that we wish. What's important right now is that we spray that 8 megabytes chunk of memory with the address of our test variable. And this is important because, as we will later see, there are 3 indirections using RCX as both the destination and the source for the load, right? And we can use that as an indicator, as a tag, to see if the secret kernel value lies inside a particular range that we've mapped inside user space. So we sprayed the buffer with the rest of our test variable. We used the right JS-base instruction to make the JS-base point to our target kernel address. And then we issue a user-to-kernel transition. And everything happens as before for now. SWAPGS gets executed. The JS-base and kernel JS-base get swapped. JS-base now points to the KPCR as it should. Kernel JS-base points to the attacker-controlled memory. And the vulnerable gadget is hit again. And the branch is mispredicted yet again, Spectre in action. SWAPGS gets executed speculatively again. JS-base points to the attacker-controlled memory. And we begin to access this attacker-controlled memory. So RCX is loaded with the secret value. And then RCX is loaded with a value located at that address plus the offset to 20, which in this case you can see that the value that it loads inside RCX is basically pointing to our test variable, right? And we use the following instruction, which is another indirection, another access using RCX, to basically force test variable to get cached. So the test variable is basically used like a tag, just to see if the secret kernel value is within the range that we've mapped inside user space. And the mispeculation is detected, everything is rolled back, the GS bases are switched again, and all the modifications to the microarchitectural speculative state is being discarded. But the test variable remains cached. And the reason why we use the test variable, which can be small in size, is because it's way easier to see whether one variable got cached instead of checking an entire 8 megabytes chunk of memory and see which line got cached, right? Because by the time you would iterate through the entire 8 megabytes chunk, you could potentially evict the line that got cached, right, when the gadget executed speculatively. So we use this test variable as an indicator to see if the value is within our range. We get back inside the user space, we measure the access time to the test variable, and we see it's cached. Now we know that the secret kernel value is within the range that we've mapped inside user space. And this only narrows it down to, for now, 8 megabytes. So what can we do to further refine this search? Well, we can basically split this interval in half. We can zoom in on this, right? We can do a binary search. We repeat the attack by halving that memory range, okay? We repeat the attack, we do the exact same thing, and we see initially that it's not cached. We repeat the attack on the other half, and we see it's cached. We halve it again, and we do it again and again and again until we zoom into whatever granularity we want, which can usually be a cache line in size, right? So within a 64 bytes range. Okay, so this is the specials of our attack, the way that we used the kernel value as an address in order to infer its value. But of course, the attack involved more engineering than this. And the two most important aspects of successfully mounting such an attack are that the branch before the SWAPGS instruction must be mispredicted somehow, and that the KVA shadow variable, which is tested before the branch, must not be cached. We won't go into the details of these, because they have already been demonstrated by Jan Horn, by all those smart guys who pioneered the sidechannel stuff. Basically, you could force the branch misprediction by simply executing similar branches with opposite outcome of what you want. You could evict the KVA shadow by trashing the cache. There are several ways. We don't go into the details of it. Another two issues that are of particular interest for us is the test variable alignment and the cache line bias. All right? So what is the test variable alignment? The test variable, we spray its address inside the user space. All right? And the secret value may be aligned to 0, may be aligned to 1, to 2, to 3, and so on. So we don't know how to spray the address of the test variable inside our user space buffer, right? Because if we spray the address starting with address 0 and the secret value ends in 3, so it's not keyword aligned, we wouldn't get a hit inside our test variable. And what we could simply do is basically attempt all the possible offsets, which are just 8. And since most of the computers have plenty of cores to choose from, you could, launch the attack on each core, each one running a different offset, and you could check if the test variable got cached on any of them. Right? And this is the example where the test variable is sprayed at offset 0, but the secret value is aligned to 1, and we wouldn't get a hit. The test variable wouldn't be properly accessed, and we wouldn't get the cache signal that we are after to confirm that the secret value is within our range. The second issue is the cache line bias, which basically simply states that the value that we detect could potentially be within a 64 bytes range, right? Because the cache uses lines which are regularly 64 bytes in size. If the kernel value is 163, for example, we wouldn't know for sure. We would just know that the secret value is somewhere in between 140 and 180, which is still pretty good, if you ask me. All right. So as for the speed, the first variant is very fast. So in our tests, we could trigger the speculative execution inside the kernel in less than 1 millisecond, and it takes usually less than 10 tries, 10 speculative executions of the gadget to get the cache signal that we are after. The second variant is obviously much slower because it has to iterate through the entire address space, the entire accessible user mode address space, to see the range that the secret kernel value is located in. And there is also the issue of the leakable domain, because since we use the values as addresses, and since the 64-bit architecture is very restrictive in regard to addresses, the value has to be canonical. So it has to resemble a valid user mode address. So the upper 16 bits all have to be all zeros or ones. And using regular paging, which is 48 bits, the leakable domain, doing a quick statistics on the Windows RS5 kernel, is at about 33%. And since Intel is very nice and is extending the address space to 57 bits, this only extends the leakable domain to 51%. All right, so mitigations. There are several mitigations, but the most obvious, simple one is serialize all branches which involve SWAPGS, okay? So if you have an if and SWAPGS is involved, you'd have to serialize both the branch that is taken and the branch that is not taken, okay? Because once you serialize this, basically you inhibit speculative execution, and instructions cannot start to randomly, speculatively access GS-based memory. You could also use techniques such as clobbering the user mode GS on context switches. You could make use of supervisory mode access prevention if the CPU has the meltdown patches, or you could instrument the kernel yourself and serialize the SWAPGS branches yourself. So in conclusions, we have presented the new Spectre variant, which abuses the fact that SWAPGS can be executed speculatively. And we presented what we hope it is an interesting technique of leaking values by treating them as addresses. And yes, Microsoft published the patches way back in July 2019. The vulnerability was made public in August the 6th. And yeah, thank you. questions?
So, okay.
Yep.
So thank you for your talk. I would be interested, how did you start your research? What was the starting point for this complex project?
Well, so what was the starting point? Well, initially, the starting point was the revolutionary research of Google and Daniel Groos and WUSEC University in Amsterdam. We just took a look at different stuff that we thought maybe no one took a look at them because they weren't interesting. And it started by seeing that SWAPGS gets to be executed speculatively. We went into then speculative segmentation, and it was a continuous process. Unfortunately, there wasn't a moment of eureka. We discovered this. It was more like brick over brick over brick of building this attack from scratch. Yes? So if ARM has this kind of vulnerability, is that correct?
Does ARM have this kind of vulnerabilities?
So SWAPGS is x86 specific. So we don't expect ARM to be vulnerable to something very similar to this. But we are not very ARM savvy, so we cannot exclude that something similar with other instructions might exist on ARM. So this particular one, no. Others similar to this, maybe.
Do you think, just like Rowhammer, that this exploit could be made exploitable with JavaScript?
So this exploit can be made exploitable with JavaScript. Well, this is a good question. We haven't thought about this, but we made use of the right JS-based instruction to make the attacker-controlled memory being pointed by JS-base. So it involves the use of instructions which you cannot normally use inside JavaScript. So I'd say no, but well, in InfoSec you can't really say no. So I'd say probably not.
First of all, thanks for the great talk and presentation. You presented some mitigations and yeah, also the hypervisor specific one. For my or our point of view, the architectural-based specific mitigations would be the best. So my question would be, when do you think would introduce something like the Rowhammer-based mitigations that were introduced that seem to be bypassed also nowadays? So when do you think would be the first step to introduce new architecture that are resistant? And first of all, do you think that this would be for long-term mitigation? It's a little bit speculative, but this would be.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot speculate, of course, but so strictly talking about the SWAPGS, Intel specified that they are not intending to fix this in silicon for now, and the mitigation is strictly in software. So just use fencing instructions to serialize this. As for the bigger picture of fixing the silicon, they're already trying to fix what they can, but you have performance versus security, and the regular users are not concerned about security as much as they are about performance, right? Because they don't really care that someone somewhere might exploit them. What they care about is their machine working flawlessly, right? So the possibility of an attack versus the basically the reality of performance which hits him each time he uses its computer. All right, thank you very much for attending.
Thanks.